Okay, I see the chat.
All right, so we have a bunch of people joining right now. So I just wanted to, first of all, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for taking part in the 8th Annual Delaware River Watershed Forum. Uh-oh, let me mute some folks right now.
Rita, am I able to mute everyone during?
Yeah, please do. That would be wonderful.
What time's your class?
How do I do that?
There should be a little button maybe towards the bottom, or if you look at the click on participants.
Okay.
Did you find it? Okay. Alrighty. Cool. So my name is Rita Yelda. I am the Outreach and Communications Manager for the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed. We're so excited to be bringing you the 3rd day of the Delaware River Watershed Forum. Normally we're not online, we're in person at a rotating location throughout the watershed. We're bringing it to you online this year. And just a couple of housekeeping things that I want to go over. So you are in the session, Why Business is a Key Partner in Watershed Protection. And I just want to go to the next slide. And then, so this session is being recorded and it will be shared. Attendees are going to be muted. But then, if you do have questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat box. We're going to do a Q&A at the end. Bob is going to help us facilitate that. So if you have any questions about any of the presentations, you could either raise your hand and we will get to you, or you could use the chat box and just type your questions as they arise. If you're having any technical issues, I am here to help out. Send me a message in the chat box. Again, my name is Rita Yelda. Feel free to just send me like a private message and I'm happy to help out. And then I also just wanted to say that I'm also going to be kind of making sure that we try to stay on time today because I know that there are other sessions after this. And if you haven't yet signed up for Schedge, you are missing out because that is where all of the forum program is, and we have like all sorts of different bio speakers, and you can actually make your schedule there for the forum. It's super duper helpful. So please check it out. You can find out your next session by going there as well. Let me see, what else did I want to say? I think that's about it. I really suggest, especially if we have any kind of discussion or chat, or especially for the Q&A, for folks to take themselves, or for you to share your camera so that people can see you and have a conversation with you. That's one of the big highlights of the forum, is being able to see other conservationists and talk to them and other professionals who are working in this field. So, I really do encourage you to put your camera on. I know folks are shy, but put your camera on and really engage, because you're going to get the most out of this if we do that. So with that, I am going to pass it off to Bob, who is going to introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much, Rita. And thank you everyone for joining this session. Before we get to our panel, I would love to tell you a little bit about what I do. By the way, I'm the Executive Director of the New York Sustainable Business Council. My name is Bob Rossi. And the New York Sustainable Business Council, I'll be saying NYSBC for short, our mission is to advance a vibrant, just, and sustainable economy in New York State. We're the New York State affiliate of the American Sustainable Business Council, or ASBC. So generally speaking, we work to promote the triple bottom line business ethic. Raise your hand if you are familiar with the term triple bottom line. Haha, kidding you. I can't see your hands, but I imagine a lot of you are not familiar. Even in the business community, a lot of people aren't familiar with that term, and the idea is to measure the success of your business not just by the bottom line, what we refer to as the financial bottom line, but also in how well you are taking care of your people, staff, customers, and the planet. You may have heard of it referred to as people, planet, and profit. So we educate policymakers about these actually quite common values in the business community, but they're not well represented by the corporate lobbyists that our elected officials are most often hearing from as business representatives. So our elected officials hear this false narrative that pits the economy against environmental and public health. And the truth of the matter is that a strong economy depends entirely on a clean environment and a healthy citizenry. And that may make sense when you think about it, but it's not well represented. And there's this sort of majority silent voice of small, independent, and the local businesses that you know and love that believe in these values. They vastly outnumber the largest corporations. They are the largest drivers of job growth in your state. And so one of the things we do is work to connect those business leaders with our elected officials on issues important to them. I know from personal experience, as a business owner, when I first came in contact with the New York Sustainable Business Council and the American Sustainable Business Council, that when I was introduced to elected officials, that I could see the impact, and I can see how that changed the narrative on some issues. One issue that is relevant to our watershed has been the fossil fuel fight. When NYSBC started 7 years ago, we cut our teeth on the anti-fracking movement in New York State. We helped rally over 1,000 businesses to sign on to a Businesses Against Fracking New York letter. We supported county level bans, et cetera. And on December 17, 2014, when Governor Cuomo announced the ban on fracking, that fight did not end. We, along with so many allies, pivoted. It was another 7 months before any actual regulation rolled out from the DEC. And New York State has continued to receive fracking waste from other states, which, due to a federal loophole, the oil and gas industry does not need to disclose what chemicals are in their waste. It's under proprietary information. So this waste has been disposed of in our water treatment plants, which have no ability to filter out the chemicals that they know nothing about. It's even been disposed of, or not disposed of, it's been used as a de-icer on some of our highways. And so you can imagine, hopefully, I still can't see your hands, but some of you, I'm hoping, are using them to slap your forehead, because it is just incomprehensible how we, as allegedly the most intelligent species on Earth, are doing things like this to ourselves. Clearly, this impacts our watershed, it impacts our people. But this fight goes on. We have been pushing on a uniform treatment of waste bill that finally passed the New York State Legislature, and that bill forces the oil and gas waste to be labeled hazardous, so it needs to be transported as hazardous waste and disposed of as hazardous waste. And it passed this year and was signed by our governor just last month. And even more recently, just last Thursday, the Delaware River Basin Commission voted to halt construction of a proposed liquefied natural gas LNG facility in Gibbstown, New Jersey. So, and the fight continues, as with so many issues. And in many of these issues, water is the great connector to the impact it has on our people, on jobs, on our economy. So New York State is not the lone wolf in this. We have Sustainable Business Council equivalents in many states across the US. And so the New York Sustainable Business Council and the New Jersey Sustainable Business Council, the Delaware Sustainable Business Council, and the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania have been collaborating on a Delaware watershed campaign called Clean Water is Good for Business. This project is coordinated by ASBC, and I will drop some of the materials for that campaign into the chat in a second, and encourage you to use them. I just want to read you the summary paragraph on our principles document. The Delaware River Basin is a valuable ecological and economic resource that supplies drinking water to 5% of the population of the United States. The Delaware Basin contributes over 22 billion in annual economic activity, supports 600,000 direct and indirect jobs with $10 billion in wages in the coastal, farm, ecotourism, water and wastewater, ports, and recreation industries. Even companies that do not directly rely on the basin to create their products need it to fulfill their day-to-day functions, as clean water is necessary to keep employees healthy and productive. Yet water runoff and other contamination problems continue to threaten the Delaware River watershed. So I hope you can see from that the role that business can play in shifting that narrative and protecting our watersheds. So here today, we're discussing why business is a key partner in watershed protection. Our panel includes a Pennsylvania state representative and 2 members of the Clean Water is Good for Business Steering Committee. So Leanne Krueger is going to kick it off. She's a state legislator in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's 161st district, and she's also previous executive director of the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia.
Thanks so much, Bob.
Absolutely.
Can you hear me? Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, folks, for joining us today. Not only was I the first executive director of the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia, which I led for 8 years, I also served on the member of ASBC for a long time until my legislative schedule prevented me from joining board meetings regularly, and I gave up my board spot. But I deeply, deeply share the values of the folks who join gatherings like this. So my job is to tell you a little bit about what we're up against. After working in the sustainable business movement for over a decade, I led the Sustainable Business Network of Philadelphia, and then I worked at the national affiliate, Bali Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, which has changed its name to Common Future. So I come out of the same values-led business movement that I think many of you share. I ran for office 6 years ago because I realized that government was very much a barrier to the issues that I cared about. And I realized that the business voices in my state capital were not the business voices that I was serving back at home. And so I ran and flipped a seat 5 years ago in a special election. I've served on the Environmental Resources and Energy Committee in our state house the entire time that I've been in office. And I want to tell you a little bit about what we're up against in this fight, because until I got to the state capitol myself, I didn't realize how powerful our adversaries are on the other side of this fight. So in Pennsylvania, like what Bob said, the fracking industry is a huge power player. We only have a moratorium on fracking in state parks right now, but fracking has been pretty pervasive in Pennsylvania for a number of years now. And the power of those oil and gas companies and the power of the coal companies that came before them is just so formidable in our state capital. We've got a majority chairman of the Environmental Resources and Energy Committee who does not actually believe that climate change exists. We have a former Speaker of the House who is the biggest recipient of campaign contributions from oil and gas companies in the state. And ultimately, a majority chairman gets to decide what bills run in and out of their committee, and the Speaker of the House gets to decide what bills run on the floor. And so I have been in an existential fight with colleagues on the other side of the aisle for the past 5 years who fundamentally do not agree with me that we need to protect our air and water. I want to give you one example of a bill that we fought a couple times, including earlier this year. The oil and gas companies really get to push whatever legislation they want, and they are constantly pushing to loosen regulations on their industry. So we literally fought a bill that would allow them to take fracking wastewater, which has been proven to be carcinogenic and radioactive, and use it on our roads to de-ice them in the winter. And this same bill included language that opened up how much they could spill without having to clean it up. Previously, you could spill a couple of gallons of radioactive fracking fluid and not be responsible, but they ran a bill through our Pennsylvania State Legislature that would allow a swimming pool's worth of radioactive fracking fluid to be spilled with no responsibility on the company for cleanup. Now, we know that these fracking fluids, they have significant public health impacts. We now have cancer clusters in a number of places in Pennsylvania where finally our Department of Health has research underway. As in New York, the companies are not responsible for disclosing what kind of chemicals they're using. So a mom could take her kid to a doctor who's having a serious health condition, and the doctor is not even allowed to talk to her about what kind of chemicals her child may have been exposed to. And this is really horrific, folks. And so we fought a bill that would allow them to spread their wastewater on our roads, to de-ice it, to make a productive use for their waste product, and to spill a swimming pool's worth of fluid. That bill passed in the Pennsylvania legislature. And right now we have a governor, Governor Tom Wolf, who vetoes the worst environmental legislation that gets to his desk. But every single time a bill like this runs, the fracking companies and the oil and gas lobbyists and the members of the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry and the National Federation of Independent Business and Americans for Prosperity, which is the COPE organization, will come and testify on behalf of business. And the position that they bring is not the position that I know many of you hold. They fight for regulatory rollback. They fight for fracking companies to be allowed to spill their waste product and not clean it up. They fight to create an environment that's sort of like the Wild West in Pennsylvania. And so I think, the organizing work that Bob has done in New York and that some of you are involved in other places is so important, because the businesses that I used to serve through the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia did not think that we should use radioactive waste fluids on our roads. But if you listen to these companies in the Capitol, they maintain that their position is the only business voice. And actually, every time there's a vote like this, we get an email saying the business vote is X. And it is always the one that is on the side of the fossil fuel industry. So I'm going to stop there. I know we've got some great presenters here today, and I'm happy to take questions when we get to the end. But just, if you don't hear anything else from me today, your voice is incredibly important. We need you to counter what the fossil fuel industry is saying to legislators. And I know that every time a business owner asks to meet with me, my door is open. Many of my colleagues, both sides of the aisle, feel the same way, and they need to be hearing from you. So thanks so much, Bob.
Thank you, Leanne. That was a great and frightening story. So let's move on to Dominique Lueckenhoff. Dominique is the Senior Vice President for Corporate Affairs and Sustainability at Hugo New. She is leading the Sustainability, Health and Safety and Environmental Programs at Kearny Point, which is a 130-acre business center in New Jersey that currently houses over 200 businesses, including startups and clean technology companies. Hugo New is owner and landlord. Dominique previously served as acting and deputy director to the EPA's Region 3 Water Protection Division. So Dominique, can you tell us more about Kearny Point, what you do, and what that has to do with the watershed?
Sure, Bob. And actually, I this time of day, I usually like to use pictures. Also keeps me on point. So maybe we can, I'll say a few words, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the significance of Kearny Point, what Hugo New has been committed to. You mentioned the 3 Ps, people, planet, profit. We now talk about that in terms of people, planet, profit, but also purpose. We've always been purpose-driven. Yes, I had a career at EPA, left. I really needed to, I have a science background, and I really needed to contribute to this climate imperative and the significant impacts. I'm from South Louisiana. Right now, I'm watching my family down there with the hurricane. And I grew up with hurricanes, but have never seen anything like in the recent years in terms of the devastation and impacts. But I think many of us know New Jersey is in the top 5 #1 flood states. I actually reside in the Delaware. Our Kearny Point facility is in the lower Passaic, but I think the comparison is that these are historic industrialized rivers, rivers that gave much to this country. And I'll talk about that in a minute in terms of where we are, but certainly with regards to the Delaware. And I'll just mention that one more thing, Bob, you mentioned the Delaware, the horseshoe crab, which is significant to the Delaware Bay, is now being utilized in terms of the blood for developing COVID vaccine. And there's a concern there. So this is all about balance and ecosystem and connectivity and inclusivity. Delaware has over 800 diverse communities and how we work together. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of bearing upon my career at EPA. In fact, I was responsible under my programs for the Delaware River and the Delaware estuary, and to just talk about urbanized areas where many of our people live, where we have disparities in terms of livability, and what water quality for that Delaware River and local water quality means, what we're doing about it as a business and why it's important to us. So just real quickly, I think many of you may know that imperviousness, that's land development, really impacts water quality. We build everything on a slope. So we see water runs off. In an impervious area, 5 times more runoff than in a forested area, which is why we want to keep our forested areas. But where we live, we also see impervious cover causes urban heat island, 500 deaths a year. So green infrastructure, and I know there have been great presentations this week on green infrastructure, helps to reduce that impact. So you see this slide, there have been studies showing that as little as 10% impervious cover in a watershed can result in stream and watershed degradation. Also, it's important for minimizing localized flooding. You can't see that nice map there, but a lot of work has been done in the Delaware River and Basin, DRBC, Delaware Estuary, other groups that have contributed to the science and mapping demographics, but also here you see where the darker areas are more imperviousness. So you're going to see more impact in those areas. The upper regions of Delaware, we're trying to keep them protected, and we're seeing great results by New York. The next slide. Next slide, please. So just before that one, sorry, I just want everyone to see the impacts of imperviousness. So you can see from the slide in the upper left, that's 5% imperviousness impact on the same, on a watershed, right to 30% imperviousness. Some of the pollutant impacts, and we just heard about fracking. Gosh, our waters are so threatened these days. And for those of you, now we're seeing, you may have heard of these perfluoral compounds, which are significantly threatening and impactful to from a carcinogenic standpoint, a neurological standpoint, and it's so pervasive. It was Teflon coating and anti-retardants. It's everywhere. It's actually in our bodies, but we're seeing significant amounts of it. It's even coming up in dairy cows' milk. Really, we all need to be doing our share in terms of educating ourselves and being mindful of what we can do and how our communities are being impacted. What's good for a community is good for business. What's good for business should be good for a community. We're connected. So road salts, you just heard about runoff. This is all non-point source runoff. And so next slide, you start to see a lot of erosion and sedimentation occurring. And this is where successful solutions are being driven by groups here, as well as our states. The state of New Jersey, which is where our Kearny Point site is located, is actually now requiring, to the extent possible, to utilize green infrastructure approaches to meet the stormwater requirements. So green infrastructure, just real quickly, I have a feeling most of you know what that is, but it's nature-based solutions. removing imperviousness and substituting that with, for example, vegetated practices, rain gardens, infiltration, even capture and storage, and even reuse of that, treating rain as a resource. There are also high performance technologies that can capture over 140 inches an hour. So business is driving these solutions, and we're all about supporting these types of emerging technologies for a circular economy. Again, we are driven by water, we're driven by climate. And one of the other areas I wanted to bring up that typically is not discussed in these types of forums, but certainly as it relates to economies and business, is where brownfields redevelopment. The brownfields universe economically is in the trillions of dollars, actually. There's still over 450,000 brownfield sites. When many abandon our industrialized areas and left neighborhoods without revenue sources. And in fact, I worked in the environmental justice program at EPA, and in many of these areas, as well rural areas that don't have the necessary infrastructure. How do we enable livability for all of these communities? So there are abandoned sites everywhere. The brownfields was really kind of that first public-private partnership EPA pursued to get business investment. And to give you an idea, redevelopment of a brownfield, there's been studies showing that it brings anywhere from 30 to 100 million dollars in local revenues, additional revenues to our communities. So the next thing I want to just sort of quickly go through is how does that relate to what we're doing at Hugo, New and Kearny Point? So the next slide, please. Breaking ground for a greener future. So Kearny Point is, and you'll see in the next slide, I want to talk about sort of that integration, that nexus of a brownfield to an alternative greenfield that's focused on resiliency. And why Hugo New and essentially our revered visionary Wendy New invested in this actually with her own money because she wanted to see something transformative. There has been some controversy on brownfields redevelopment. Oh, by the way, stormwater, water quality has been shown to improve significantly. But sometimes there's been displacement when something gets too good. Many of you may be hearing green infrastructure and gentrification. Well, let's not throw green infrastructure out. Let's just get how we integrate the ability to balance and provide equitable opportunities, jobs, and living conditions for everyone there. Not improve the resources and property values to move people out. That's a zoning issue and that's a local planning issue. So what we're doing at Kearny Point, this is an award-winning site. I was really intrigued by it, even in seeing this type of 21st century resilient development before I came over. Got so excited about it that I really wanted to help showcase it as a national model. So the next slide, just a little bit of history on this site. We've got a number of Navy yards. We've got the Navy Yard in South Philadelphia, and certainly a number of Navy yards that have been redeveloped, brownfields redeveloped in New York City, et cetera. This Kearny Point, many people had heard of it. And we're just outside of Newark, about 15 minutes from the Newark airport in the lower Passaic watershed. But this was one of the largest shipbuilding operations between World Wars I and II. And in fact, was part of a program called the Emergency Shipbuilding Program and turned out ships. In fact, there's some information, historical information showing that 4 to 5 destroyers were turned out in less than an hour. Employed 35,000, maybe upwards of 50,000 people, had a hospital, very much an anchor in the community. Labor union jobs, very diverse. There's a Rossi Riveter picture, I don't know if you can make it out, but African-American women, ethnic diversity at this site. And with the focus on, of course, winning the war. Beyond that, I'll just, the next slide, that's a destroyer that's leaving Kearny Point. In the late 40s, actually around 1950, the 1950s, 60s, Hugo New acquired the site and had been managing a recycling business, actually started to dismantle, hired people, started dismantling ships by hand. Eventually, Hugo New became one of the world's largest metal and steel recyclers. So you can see a picture there from the 70s. Now, as all of this is going on, like other sites, industrialized pollution is happening. Next slide. I'm going to run through these. Hurricane Sandy hit 2012. The site was 4 or 5 feet underwater. Many of us experienced the devastating impacts of Sandy, over $70 billion in damage. These are some pictures from Kearny Point. Kearny Point had many warehouse facilities. One was a liquor distributor. And actually what you see in that middle picture, over $1 million lost from that one liquor distributor. So the next slide, please. Wendy New and John New at the time. Unfortunately, we lost John New. Suddenly, years later, Wendy was left to revisit the interest that they had in how do we look at climate and how do we transform from a warehousing to a campus, a resilient green campus that attracts clean green tech, allows for single, minority-owned, women-owned businesses to thrive. So we also support incubation and emerging technologies. And in fact, was committed to the extent that she would invest her own money in it. How do we make sure that there is livability for everyone, that we're maintaining jobs? Go back to the 1940s, what we did then, but how do we do that again for the 21st century? So the next slide. So just quickly, these are our goals that kind of get to that repurposed, transformative. We raised the site 16 feet, 4 feet above FEMA. Now think of what that's doing for water quality in terms of storage and capture. The area around Kearny Point is served by Kearny Point for what we're investing. That lower slide you see down there is with the blue actually shows from our master plan retreat of some of the buildings and hardscapes from the waterfront. We're opening up the waterfront and we're going to provide access for the first time for the public. Next slide, please. Next slide. So green infrastructure is front and center here. Ecological restoration, wetland restoration. For those of you who saw this study from Sandy, it was the wetlands that were maintained around Hudson in the Hudson River that actually protected practically over hundreds of millions to $1 billion in avoided property damage. So our plan includes returning those wetlands and those marshes, again, for improved resiliency. They work better than hardscapes. Next slide, please. Kearny Point, in fact, was featured as a model for a green infrastructure development guide provided by New Jersey Future, which is a huge champion and advocate of green infrastructure and provides much support in this area. And you can see just down to the left, those are some of the best practices that we've implemented. Why should we care about this? Again, we've invested in improving the water quality in an industrialized area. We not only want to maintain it, we want to figure out how to make it better. And it's providing greater benefits to surrounding communities. Next slide, I'm about done. I'm gonna I know Bob, look, I'm from the South. So 10 minutes to us is, when you say 10 minutes, that's 20 minutes. All right. An example of what we're treating with one of our technologies at Kearny Point. Again, nothing that we have to do. That's what I was tremendously impressed by. Treating over 34 million gallons of stormwater, removing significant hydrocarbons and all the runoff that occurs. The next slide. We're actually invested in developing a green street. Green streets are for people too. This is a complete green street. I think you've all heard of that, but you probably haven't heard of a developer that's actually supporting the community and the county in developing a green street. So next slide. That's it. So I just wanted to give you an idea We've got over 200 businesses at Kearny Point. At current, obviously, we're as challenged as others in terms of addressing COVID. That's one of the responsibilities that I have with my history in public health. But consistent with what we do, Hugo, New and Kearny Point, we're using stacked state-of-the-art technologies to get risk and exposure to less than 1. So we're very focused on wellness. We are driven by water. And thanks for letting me share what we're doing at Kearny Point.
Thank you, Dominique. And a note to everyone, if you have questions, and you can, please drop them into the chat. You can share them with everyone or privately to me. We have a queue of 1 right now, so get your questions in. So let's move on to our last panelist, Elizabeth Murray. Liz is the Director of Human Resources and Communications at the Marlow Collective, a restaurant group in New York City that sources from local farmers in the Delaware Watershed, farmers that use sustainable and regenerative practices, and they work to build community around sustainable food systems. So Liz, tell us more about the Marlow Collective and help us understand the role businesses can play in supporting sustainability in their communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Leanne and Dominique, I have so many questions for you myself that I wish we could sit in this room and just talk all day about the things that you've both brought up. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we think of food and community and sustainable resources as being connected sort of intimately in what we do every day in restaurants. So I work for Andrew Tarlow. Our company runs and operates 9 businesses in Brooklyn. So 4 restaurants, a whole animal butcher shop, a wine and spirit shop, a breads bakery that almost exclusively buys bread from New York, and then a little bit of farmer ground wheat in Canada. We really think of all of those businesses as inextricably linked, and they have all sort of grown out of one another and out of a desire to sort of continue to support, both understand and support local agriculture. So really, Dominique, I'm so glad you brought up purpose, because it's something that we think about all the time and really is, I think, part of driving the bottom line. And, I think ultimately, and this question came up too in the chat about where you start with your legislators. And I think, interestingly, there's so much happening in the world right now. And I think it's our instinct to sort of try to think really big first. But I think ultimately, if you start small and really think about the ways that you can impact and afford to impact yourself personally, and then your smaller community and your larger community, those impacts grow, right, and feed off of each other and inspire each other. So I think, in all of this, and certainly with regard to how we all eat and think about our farmers, I would encourage everyone to just do, what you can, and over time to try to push yourself to think and innovate and do what you can with that. So really, Andrew opened his first restaurant 21 years ago in Williamsburg, in South Williamsburg, in a part of Brooklyn that was super industrial. And he lived in a loft with friends, and there were a bunch of artists living in the neighborhood. And he thought, okay, well, we'll just open a restaurant and feed these people who were living and kind of squatting in these illegal artist lofts. And they had steak and burgers and potatoes and martinis, lots of martinis. And he started to think about the fact that they would buy a box of strip steaks, right? You didn't have to figure out how to really utilize all the animal. You just, called your meat vendor and ordered a box of one specific type of steak. And often those steaks, there's only one of them on the cow maybe. So he started to think about and there's tons of, packaging and plastic. But for restaurants, part of the reason restaurants operate that way is because you have 30-day terms with those vendors, right? So just the economics of having money come in and out for restaurants is often very, very complicated and difficult to switch from from a long-term financial to having to think about it the short term. So he reached out to a farmer in upstate New York and like drove up with his car and bought a cow, and the farmer, and they were like, we're just going to figure out how to butcher this thing and use it. And the farmer was like, well, I need a check. If you're going to take the cow today, I need you to write me a check. So, you know, it's kind of the first understanding of what it means to financially invest in and have much more intimate relationship with. You've already paid for this thing, which is, you know, 30 days sooner than you would have had to pay for it normally. So how do you really utilize it? So, you know, that program grew. And he had some people working for him at the time who were really interested in investing their own time and figuring out how to sort of run a whole animal butcher program through this restaurant. Then he opened another restaurant next door, Marlow and Sons, and sort of grew from there. And then we opened a butcher shop in 2010. I guess it's, 18. So it's like 10 or 12 years old. And that butcher shop now purchases meat from farmers in New York and Pennsylvania mostly, and then offers that meat to our community, but also then makes it more sustainable for us to continue to move those systems through our own company, right? So by economies of scale, we're able to make what could be a really expensive concept or desire more affordable. So, you know, so that grew out of really his commitment to sustainable agriculture grew out of trying to figure out what to do about meat and how to purchase meat for the restaurant. And then they started going to the local farmers market and building relationships with farmers that he's now had for 20 years. People who are deeply important to our community and frankly important to the entire New York City community because they are protecting on their land the water, the Delaware River that, you know, runs through so much of the land in New York State for all of our drinking water, right? So we really think about purpose in sort of 3 buckets. Like, how are we doing what we can do internally to help keep farmers, help make it economically viable and sustainable for farmers to practice regenerative organic farming practices? How do we do that internally? How do we educate our community about the importance of supporting businesses that are making those choices? And then how do we use our voice to push for larger change across the state, and then, you know, hopefully make that change a model for things that other places can do across the country. So last year we started to really think about, you know, how we help make large scale change, and started pushing for a tax credit similar to what the city schools have done in New York City with tax credits around purchasing local food from local farmers. So we started pushing for the same thing for businesses in the city. And actually, when you think big, you think about the people who are really buying tons of food all the time, hospitals, you know, large entertainment venues. Like, how do we start to encourage and make it more profitable for people to think about doing that in their own businesses? So we've been working with a state representative from Andrews District that he lives in which we also have a restaurant, and with the American and New York Sustainable Business Councils on pushing forward tax legislation to try to, you know, help encourage businesses to make some of these same choices. Because honestly, as you've all seen, I think in the last 6 months, the restaurant industry it sits at the you know, nexus of all of these really important issues around food and environmentalism and immigration and community. But at the same time has, you know, I think everyone has this idea that restaurateurs are like getting rich, but it's certainly not the case. And, you know, restaurants really kind of skate on a very thin margin. So how do you try to really, and if, you know, if you're balancing the, how do I care for my people and how do I care for the environment? And, you know, margins in restaurants are usually like 3 to 6%. So, you know, how do you really think through making it more attractive for business owners to really try to think creatively about how to invest more in local and sustainable agriculture? So I could talk about this all day, but I'm actually much more interested in hearing what your questions are and answering them whatever as best I can, or, you know, having a conversation with y'all about what y'all, I'm from Texas, Dominique, I'm from the South too. So, you know, hearing from y'all and what I could possibly offer that might be interesting or useful.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz.
Yeah, of course.
So again, drop your questions into the Q&A. And one question I have, actually, I'll ask it of the host privately, but I'm curious how we can have ongoing conversations after this hour. We'll start the Q&A with a question from Tali, who noted that there is not a Pennsylvania Sustainable Business Council, and asked, how can local watershed associations in Pennsylvania find local businesses who care about the triple bottom line, with whom to connect and possibly partner on water restoration and other efforts? So I do not have a perfect answer to that. There isn't, and even in New York and New Jersey and Delaware, where we have SBCs, we don't have an exhaustive, comprehensive directory of all of the triple bottom line minded businesses, and a lot of such businesses have never even heard the phrase triple bottom line. They identify as independent or local or green or et cetera. So I would say connect with our campaign. So connect with us, and on one level, and also you are in Pennsylvania and you're on the ground. You might be in a good position to find the businesses that are impacted, that are downstream from some point of pollution, and then connect them with us so that we can use their voice to fight that pollution. And your question reminded me that I still have yet to paste some documents. So I have a list of documents here from a link to our campaign webpage, and I'll just drop it all into the notes, into the chat, excuse me. And
Bob, if I can just interject too. So the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia still exists. They preceded, you know, the Sustainable Business Council world and helped to found it.
mm-hmm.
They're doing significant work on green. You know, Dominique talked a lot about green infrastructure. They've been doing work with that industry for almost a decade now. So also, if you're in Pennsylvania, if you're in the southeastern part of the Commonwealth, Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia is a wonderful resource for you.
Thank you so much. I don't know why I'm having trouble pasting. I could type. That's me testing that I can type, but I'm not pasting. Let me try to paste one thing. It might be a formatting issue. Let's see. So that's our campaign webpage that I just pasted. And let's see. Oh. And also the Rodale Institute, we work with directly in Pennsylvania, but all right, I did it. Okay, I have all the, thanks, Leanne. Leanne just posted a link to SBN in the notes, and above that are all the links to our materials. So moving on in the Q&A, Rita asks, do businesses need to have, this is for all presenters, any presenter who wants to grab onto this, do businesses need to have money to invest in order to turn their businesses green? Liz, do you want to speak to that? Because I find your perspective on this particularly interesting, as you represent restaurants, and there are so many restaurants and such a thin margin. And you're working with farmers who are also dealing with a thin margin. So how do you make the economics of all that sustainable? And you're muted.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we haven't fully cracked, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. To be honest, I don't think we fully cracked that code yet, right? I mean, I think ultimately it's a day-to-day balance between what we can, you know, do for our staff and what we can do for to really be a better partner to our farmers. I think ultimately what I said at the very beginning is, you know, stands. It's to find something that you feel really passionate about, some aspect of your business that you feel really passionate about, and can see sort of a pathway, a real opportunity to drive change around that thing. And then focus on that and let the connections, you know, internal connections and external connections that come from that grow. You know, I think Andrew started really small, both in terms of how he grew the business and how he grew into a more responsible business owner. And I think, like I said, I think ultimately we want to sort of solve everything at one time, especially people, I'm preaching to the choir here because I'm sure everyone in this room feels that way, but I think ultimately you're a lot more successful, or we've seen a lot more success in taking pieces of it and solving for that piece, and then thinking about how that fits into the holistic, you know, nature of our business, and then taking another piece and solving for that. You know, otherwise it's just overwhelming.
I just maybe comment, agree, Liz. And in fact, it doesn't have to be complicated, but what you have, because there's a lot of information out there on the web. In fact, even by your specific business sector. You know, I'm going to go as basic as a commercial cleaning operation. Green infrastructure, there are janitorial services that have transformed what they do because it's landscaping. But start with evaluating your footprint, your impact, water conservation, energy conservation, recycling, those kinds of things that you can look at how much you use. You know, it goes from simply looking at your life and how you live it, and then accessing all the information out there and starting with certain steps. But it can get as, you know, complex as LEED, being a green certified. For example, there's LEED for buildings that you've probably heard of, but it's all out there. You don't have to have a certain pot of money. In fact, you can save money by looking at these kinds of actions you can incorporate, and then you can promote that. You know, we conserved this much water last year. We didn't use plastic cups, you know, for businesses. Yeah, check out the Philadelphia Sustainable Business Council. Has a lot of good information, but it's all out there.
Grant, thank you, Dominique. Grant earlier posted a link to the B Corporation .net to the B Corp directory. I'll repost it, and that is also a great way. That is a triple bottom line certifier, and it's a great way to find businesses. An answer to an earlier question. Taiki asked a great question that I'd like to share to any panelists who'd like to take it on. How would one go about dismantling the racist systemic structures that enable the disparities for entrepreneurs of color in sustainable business community? I find that environmental progress cannot be achieved if racism is not addressed. Hope this isn't too off topic. It isn't.
Bob, I can give one example of what we've done in Pennsylvania. I think the impact that COVID has had on businesses has just shined a light on the structural racism that already exists and the structural injustice. We in the Pennsylvania legislature, you know, businesses are still struggling very, very significantly. And so we use some of the CARES Act money, the federal money that we got in Pennsylvania for a new grant program, $225 million in grants, not loans. We did allocate $100 million early on for loans, but they went very fast. And we were hearing from entrepreneurs that they couldn't afford to take on more debt. They really needed grants other than loans. And so we allocated $225 million for a new grant program this year, and half of that was earmarked for historically disadvantaged businesses. And the majority of that money, the last application period closed, I think 2 weeks ago. I know at least in the first round, a large part of that was pushed out to historically to disadvantaged businesses, including predominantly businesses owned by African-American folks. And we need to do more of that in government. We need to accept and acknowledge the fact that white supremacy has caused an unjust system and make sure that entrepreneurs who've been most impacted most benefit from new grant and loan programs.
Thank you, Leanne. Dominique.
That's a real loaded one. Gosh, if we could just solve systemic racism, it is, as Representative just indicated with COVID, it's been built and stacked. It's integrated into our society. And I love that we can sort of just start with how money flows, particularly public money. And I'll just say this coming from my previous career in public service. Public agencies have a requirement. It's 8A in terms of minority business, women business, to demonstrate to the degree, extent possible that that money is being utilized towards those businesses. That's a requirement by law. So I can tell you, EPA putting out billions of dollars for a variety of programs, including compliance and business assistance. But for example, in this area of green infrastructure, hold your public entities accountable. Transparency, that's important. And I think the reason we're seeing the sea change happening is because people can look at it on their phones. They can look at events playing out. So educate yourself. We just heard, a set aside. We heard that, from the representative, there was intent as your elected officials, vote, but certainly educate yourself, find out where the dollars are flowing. That's just one example. And this is, I think, a whole nother symposium beyond that, because the reason Black and brown people are dying is, I think we know that there's poor access to healthcare. From an environmental standpoint, more respiratory diseases because there's more harmful air emissions in places where they live. So, it is an ecosystem. That particular ecosystem was marginalized from day one. So all it took was COVID to just tip it right over. So we really do have to go back to the foundation, but we got to look at what people are required to do by law and hold them accountable.
Thank you so much, Dominique.
Can I just add one thing here too? I guess from our perspective, sorry, I'll just be really quick, but from our perspective, I've been thinking and talking a lot about reparations and what reparations look like in the form of ownership of land for Black and brown people and communities, with regard to how that impacts those communities and the food system in general. But I mean, I think ultimately we touched a little bit on the money piece, but I think ultimately it's about transparency about where the money is going and having a real conversation in this country about what reparations look like.
Wow. Yes, thanks for adding that. Absolutely. We're at the hour, and I learned that we can keep going. And if there are more questions, which there are, I personally have to get going, but I have someone who can take over. So a question for you, Rita, if you're still here.
I'm here.
Okay, so if I look in it looks like we have 37 participants still here with us. So, and Colton, are you?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. So, Colton, if you can take over for me.
Sure.
And, look in the chat for questions that I haven't posed. And I don't want to suddenly obligate the speakers to stay. And I understand that you might also have 11 o'clock obligations. So, but I'll just sort of, we're all humans, we're all adults. Let's stick for as long as you can. I apologize that I have to sign off. This has been great and educational for me as well. I really appreciate it, and props to all the speakers today. Thanks, and I look forward to, this is being recorded, so I look forward to going back and hearing all that I missed. Reach out if you have any questions. Absolutely. Bye.
Thanks. And Rita and Colton, I actually have voting session in just a couple of minutes. So if there's any policy questions, if you can kick them to me, I'm happy to take one or two, and then I'm going to have to sign off as well.
Sure. Well, here, one question from earlier on that I think Bob may have missed, which I think might be a good one for you, Leanne, to start off on. It was just as a first step, if businesses want to make their voice heard with legislators, how should they get started? How should they go about that?
So there's certainly strength in numbers. So, in places where you can organize with some fellow business owners to talk about the issues that matter to you, that's important. But if you haven't already reached out to your elected officials and asked for a meeting, you're probably not going to get your congressperson to come to your district, but your state legislator or your state senator. We do business visits all the time. It's one of my favorite things to do. So reach out and invite them to your place of business. And when they're there, talk about one or two issues that matter to you and matter to your employees, especially in the midst of the COVID pandemic. We really wanted to be talking about what is needed most right now in a budget environment of limited resources to have the biggest impact to help your businesses survive. So I would reach out and set up a meeting and invite them to come to you if you've got something that you want to show off.
Great, thank you.
That too, we've had great success in going to our, state legislators, local. I think even just reaching out, people have our legislators through the COVID period and prior to that have been very responsive. I think actually, and I don't want to speak for you or Leanne, but I think actually it's helpful for them to have people who want to engage in dialogue about what their constituents are facing.
Yeah, and it gives them a counterpoint. So when the National Federation of Independent Business, which really only speaks for multinational corporations despite their name, comes to meet with them, they've spoken to folks who are actually located in their district and they know that they've got a different perspective.
Great, thank you. And I'll add briefly that we did put some links down there below about some ways that our campaign is engaging and connecting businesses with policymakers. So if you're a business owner, business owners or leaders, you can point them towards our campaign, and that is a lot of the work that we do in Watershed. So one other question for Leanne, if you have time before you jump.
I'll take one more, Colton.
Great. So this one was directed at you. How much research is being done in Pennsylvania to offset pressure from oil, gas, and coal businesses? Is there adequate research on the deleterious health effects of constituents of fracking waste to refute the claims of these business interests? How can we support more?
There hasn't been enough historically. And I've lost count of the numbers of hearings that I've sat at and spoken at for the Environmental Resources and Energy Committee, where I've talked about clean air and clean water. And Republican legislators in fracking country will get really angry when I talk about clean air and clean water and say, well, our air is clean and our water is clean, because there's really no metrics to prove them otherwise. The fracking industry has suppressed research for a long time, but our Department of Health has started on a longitudinal study to look at the health impacts of living by a fracking site. That's really important research. And Mom's Clean Air Force, which is another nonprofit group, has commissioned a number of studies that have shown things like the low birth weights of babies that have lived by a fracking site. But because that research has been suppressed, we haven't always had good counterpoints, and the industry will come in every time and say, oh, it's safe. Oh, I have the Mariner East 2 pipeline coming through my district, which I fought for years. And every time they would leak drilling fluid into an aquifer, they would say, well, it's just mud. It's just mud. And when we finally were able to get some intel on what was in that drilling fluid, it was way more than just mud and not something that I want in my drinking water. So anyone who's in the research world, please, this is an area where we need more work, and make sure if you do have findings that you're reaching out to your legislators to let them know, because I need all the tools that I can get to fight these fracking companies in Pennsylvania. I'm going to sign off now, but thanks folks for joining us today. Liz, I was on your website as you were speaking. I want to come and shop at your businesses once COVID is over and it's safe to travel again. So it was great to be on the panel with you, and Dominique, you as well.
Great, thank you, Leanne. All right. I actually am not able to see the Q&A, but I can see some questions in the chat. So Rita, if there's any others that you want to jump in with.
Yeah, why don't we just do one last question from Rachel. Rachel asks, over the last couple of years, we're seeing increased funding for conservation and restoration in the Delaware River watershed. So for example, increasing public funding via the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then Rachel asks, are there opportunities for businesses to help leverage those core resources to get a bigger bang for the buck? And how can we best make those connections with businesses that want to also invest in restoration and conservation? So how can we leverage federal funding and connect with businesses for these grant funds and for restoration and conservation?
That's a really good question. In fact, I think there might have been some panels earlier that addressed that. The conservation movement, along with the data and information that's been collected, showing the importance of maintaining public recreational spaces, and how private entities, so land trusts. I know I live in the New Hope area in Bucks County, which has had a legacy of businesses and actually families as well, but deeding private land and maintaining that in conservation. There's an area that I'm working on now, as a matter of fact, really nationally, because I've maintained a focus on private assets for public good. And it's consistent with that conservation mindset. So if money comes in to preserve an area, and there are actually farms that work with these programs, they actually put up or provide their riparian areas as those conservation easements. Businesses can do the same. We're looking at opening up our waterfront area to provide more non-developed space for high performance green infrastructure, and as well our restored wetland areas. So GIS programs are out there. I'm sure if you Google that, you're going to find that any number of organizations are happy to work with you as a business, determining where you are and how there are opportunities to use your land. But also, I think even in fundraising, there are other aspects of leveraging that can happen. But how we support and even writing in to support more public space and conserve land to protect those resources, including water supply.
And I would add that the American Sustainable Business Council and New Jersey Sustainable Business Council were actually exploring with some of our other partners opportunities in Camden, New Jersey, and then hopefully beyond that, working on the ground with businesses in the community to leverage the resources provided by the Delaware Watershed conservation programs, and being able to facilitate green stormwater infrastructure. That's a future project and something we'll be working on moving forward. So look out for that. We'll be able to answer that question even better next year. Yeah, I believe that's all the questions, unless Rita, you have anything left?
No, we are all in good shape. The last thing I wanted to mention is that we do have a survey for the forum. If you could take our survey really quick, let us know what you think, and then you can find your next session for the forum on Sketch. And I just wanted to thank all of our presenters today. Thank you so much for taking the time. And thank you, Colton, for stepping in to help with the Q&A. It's really been a pleasure and I've learned so much. So have a great rest of your day and I'll see you at a future session.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.